Let's go ahead and get going. All right, here we go. Gonna go back one paragraph. The changeover for warlike activities and kidnapping must have affected all branches of economic activity and agriculture in particular. Occasionally in certain localities, food production was increased to provide supplies for slave ships. But the overall consequence of slaving on agricultural activities in Western Europe and Central Africa were negative. Labor was drawn off from agriculture and conditions became unsettled. Dahomey, which in the 16th century was known for exporting food to parts of what is now Togo, was suffering from famines in the 19th century. The present generations of Africans will readily recall that in the colonial period, when all bodied men left their homes as migrant laborers, that upset the farming routine in the home districts and often caused famines. Slave trading, after all, meant migration of labor in a manner 100 times more brutal than disruptive. To achieve economic development, one essential condition is to make the maximum use of the country's labor and natural resources. Usually that demands peaceful conditions, but there have been times in history when social groups have grown stronger by raiding their neighbors for women, cattle, and goods, because they then used the quote booty, end quote, from the raids for the benefit of their own community. Slaving in Africa did not even have that redeeming value. Captives were shipped outside instead of being utilized within the given African community for creating wealth from nature. It was only as an accidental byproduct that in some areas Africans who recruited captives for Europeans realized that they were better off keeping some captives for themselves. In any case, slaving prevented the remaining population from effectively engaging in agriculture and industry, and it employed professional slave hunters and warriors to destroy rather than build. Quite apart from the moral aspects of the immense suffering that is caused, the European slave trade was economically totally irrational from the viewpoint of African development. For certain purposes, it is necessary to be more specific and to speak of the trade of slaves not in general continent-wide terms, but rather with reference to the varying impact on several regions. The relative intensity of slave raiding in different areas is fairly well known. Some South African peoples were enslaved by the Boers, and some North African Muslims by Christian Europeans, but those were minor episodes. The zones most notorious for human export were, firstly, West Africa from Senegal to Angola, from the belt extending about 200 miles inland, and secondly, that part of East Central Africa, which today covers Tanzania, Mozambique, Malawi, northern Zambia, and eastern Congo. Furthermore, within each of those broad areas, finer distinctions can be drawn. It might therefore appear that slave trade was not adversely affect the development of some parts of Africa simply because exports were non-existent or at a low level. However, the contention that European slave trade was an underdeveloping factor for the continent as a whole must be upheld, because it does not follow that the African districts which did not trade with Europe was entirely free from whatever influences were exerted by Europe. European trade goods percolated into the deepest interior, and more significantly, the orientations of large areas of the continent towards human export meant that other positive interactions were thereby ruled out. The above proposition may be more fully grasped by making some comparisons. In any given economy, the various components reflect the well-being of others. Therefore, when there is depression in one sector, that depression invariably transfers itself into others to some extent. Similarly, when there is buoyancy in one sector, then others benefit. Turning to biological sentences, it will be found that students of ecology recognize that a single change, such as the disappearing of a snail species, could trigger off negative or positive reactions in a sphere that superficially appeared unconnected. Parts of Africa left, quote, free, end quote, by export trends in captives must have been affected by the tremendous dislocation in ways that are not easy to comprehend, because it is so much a question of what might have happened. Hypothetical questions such as, quote, what might have happened if, end quote, sometimes lead to absurd speculations, but it is entirely legitimate and very necessary to ask, quote, what might have happened if Brostiland, southern Zambia, if there were not generalized slave trading across the whole belt of Central Africa, which lie immediately north of Barotusland, end quote. Quote, what would have happened in Bongunda if the Cantonese were concentrating on selling copper to the Bangada instead of captives to Europeans? During the colonial epoch, the British forced Africans to sing, quote, rule Bartania, Bartania rule the waves, Bartans never shall be slaves. The British themselves started singing the tune in the early 18th centuries at the height of using Africans as slaves. Quote, what would have been Britain's level of development had millions of them been put to work as slaves outside of their homeland over a period of 4 centuries? Question mark. Furthermore, assuming that those wonderful fellows could never have been slaves, one could speculate further on the probable effects of their development had continental Europe been enslaved. Had that been the case, its nearest neighbor would have been removed from the ambient of fruitful trade in Britain. After all, trading between the British Isles and places like the Baltic and the Mediterranean is unanimously considered by scholars to have been the earliest stimulus to the English economy in the late feudal and early capitalist periods, even before the era of overseas expansion. One tactic that is now being employed by certain European, including America, scholars is to say that the European slave trade was undoubtedly a moral evil, but it was economically good for Africa. Ew. Here, attention will be drawn only very briefly to a few of those arguments to indicate how ridiculous they can be. One that receives much emphasis is that African rulers and other persons obtained European commodities in exchange for their captives, and this is how Africans gained, quote, wealth, end quote. This suggestion fails to take into account the fact that several European imports were competing with the strangling African products. It fails to take into account the fact that none of the long list of European articles were the type which catered into the productive process, but were rather items to be rapidly consumed or stowed away uselessly, and it incredibly overlooks the fact that the majority of the imports were of the worst quality, even as consumer goods. Cheap gin, cheap gunpowder, pots and kettles full of holes, beads, and other assorted rubbish. Following from the above, it is suggested that certain African kingdoms grew strong economically and politically as a consequence of the trade with Europeans. The greatest of the West African kingdom, such as Oye, Benin, Dahomey, and Asante, are cited as examples. Oye and Benin were great long before making contact with Europeans, and while both Dahomey and Asante grew stronger during the period of European slave trade, the roots of their achievements went back to much earlier years. Furthermore, and this is a major fallacy, is the argument of the slave trade apologists. The fact that a given African state grew politically more powerful at the same time as it engaged in selling captives to Europeans is not automatically to be attributed to the credit of the trade in slaves. A cholera epidemic may kill thousands in a country, and yet the population increases. The increase obviously came about in spite of and not because of cholera. This simple logic escapes those who speak about the European slave trade benefiting Africa. The destructive tendency of slave trading can be clearly established whenever a state seemingly progresses in the epoch of slave trading. The conclusion is simply that it did not, in spite of the adverse effects of the process that was more damaging than cholera. This is a picture that emerged from a detailed study of Dahomey. For instance, in the final analysis, although Dahomey did its best to expand politically and militarily, while still tied to slave trade, that form of economic activity seriously undermined its economic base and left it much worse off. A few of the arguments about the economic benefits of European slave trade for Africa amounts to nothing more than saying that exporting millions of captives was a way of avoiding starvation in Africa. To attempt to reply to that would be painful and time wasting. But perhaps a slightly more subtle version of the same argument requires a reply, namely the argument that Africa gained because in the process of slave trading, new food crops were acquired from the American continent, and this became staples of Africa. The crops in question are maize and cassava, which became staples in Africa late in the 19th century and in the present century. But the spread of food crops is one of the most common phenomena in human history. Most crops originated in only one of the continents, and then social contact caused their transfer of other parts of the world. Let me get some water. Trading in slaves was not special bearing on whether crops spread. The simplest form of trade would have achieved the same results. Today, the Italians have heard wheat food like spaghetti, macaroni, and their staple, while most Europeans use the potato. The Italians took the idea of the spaghetti type food from the Chinese noodle after Marco Polo returned from travels there. While Europe adopted the potato from American indigenous communities, in neither case were Europeans enslaved before they could receive a benefit that was the logical heritage of all mankind. But Africans are to be told that the European slave trade developed us by bringing us maize and cassava. All the above points are taken from books and articles published recently as the fruit of research of major British and American universities. They are probably not the commonest view, even among European bourgeoisie scholars, but they are representative of the growing trend that seems likely to become the new accepted orthodoxy in metropolitan capitalist countries. And this significantly coincides with Europe's struggle against the further decolonization of Africa, economically and mentally. In one sense, it is preferable to ignore such rubbish and isolate our youth from its result. But unfortunately, one of the aspects of current African underdevelopment is that capitalist publishers and bourgeoisie scholars dominate the scene and help mold opinions the world over. It is for that reason that writing of the type which justifies the trade in slaves has to be exposed as racist bourgeoisie propaganda, having no connection with reality or logic. It is a question not merely of history, but a present-day liberation struggle in Africa. Let me see. Let me go back a little bit. Doesn't look like anybody said anything. Oh my gosh, look at this, people. God damn, dude. Technical stagnation and distortion of African economy in the pre-colonial epoch. Here we go. It has already been indicated that in the 15th century, European technology was not totally superior to that of other parts of the world. There were certain specific features which were highly advantages of Europe, which as shipping and to the lesser extent guns. European trading in Africa had to make use of Asian and African consumer goods, showing that their system of production was not absolutely superior. It is particularly striking that in the earlier centuries of trade, Europeans relied heavily on Indian cloth and resell it in Africa, and they also purchased cloth in several parts of West African coast for resale elsewhere, Morocco, Mauritania, and Senegambia, Ivory Coast, Benin, Yoruba land, and Loango were all exporters to other parts of Africa through European middlemen. Yet, by the time that Africa entered the colonial era, it was concentrating almost entirely on the export of raw cotton and the import of manufactured cotton cloth. This remarkable reversal is tied to technological advance in Europe and to stagnation of technology in Africa, owing the very trade with Europe. Cloth manufacture in the world went through a stage of handlooms and small-scale craft production. Up to the 16th century, that was the general pattern in Africa, Asia, and Europe, with Asian cloth makers being the most skilled in the world. India is the classic example where British used every means at their disposal to kill the cloth industry so that British cloth could be marketed anywhere, everywhere, including inside India itself. In Africa, the situation was not so clear-cut, nor did it require so much conscious effort of Europeans to destroy African cloth industry manufacturing, but the trend was the same. Do you see they saturate each of these markets to then make the Indian cloth expensive and stuff? I don't know. Europe benefited technologically from its external trade contacts, while Africa either failed to benefit or actual loss. Vital inventions and innovations appeared in England in late 19th century after profits from external trades had been reinvested. Indeed, the new machinery represented the investments of primary capital accumulated from trading and from slavery. African and Indian trade which strengthened British industries, which in turn crushed whatever industry existed in what is now called the quote underdeveloped end quote, countries. African demand for cloth was increasingly rapidly in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, so that there was a market for all cloth produced locally as well as room for imports from Europe and Asia. But directed by the I gotta look up this word, everybody. Where's my thing? There it is. I gotta look up this word. Let me find it real quick again. African clothes. I lost it. There it is. I found it. Hold on, everybody. Oh, come on. Do. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. Of course, it's going to take forever. QUISI. Hold on a second. ISIV. TIV. ISITIVE. Definition. Come on. Acquisitive, sorry. Acquisitive, expressively interested in acquiring money and material things. It is inquisitive. All right. But directed by an inquisitive capitalist class, European industry increased its capacity to produce on a large scale by harnessing the energy of wind, water, and coal. European cloth industry was able to copy fashionable Indian and African patterns, and eventually to replace them, partly by establishing a stranglehold on the distribution of cloth around the shores of Africa, and partly by swamping, meaning by putting their products in their markets. African products. By importing cloth in bulk, European traders eventually succeeded in putting an end to the expansion of African cloth manufacturing. There are many varied social factors which combine to determine when a society makes a breakthrough from small-scale craft technology to equipment designed to harness nature so that labor becomes more effective. One of the major factors is the existence of a demand for more products than can be made by hand, so that technology is asked to respond to a definite social need, such as that for clothes. Yeah. When European cloth became dominant in on the African market, it meant that African producers were cut off from the increasing demand. The craft producers either abandoned their task in the face of cheap available European cloth, or they continued on the same small hand-worked instruments to create styles and pieces for localized markets. Therefore, there was what can be called, quote, technological unrest, end quote, or stagnation, and in some instances, actual regression, since people forgot even the simple techniques of their forefathers. The abandonment of traditional iron smelting and most part of Africa is probably the most important instance of technological regression. Development means a capacity for self-sustaining growth. It means that the economy must register advances, which in turn will promote further progress. The loss of industry and skill in Africa is extremely small. If we measure it from the viewpoint of modern scientific achievement, or even by standards of England in the late 18th century. However, it must be borne in the mind that To be held back at one stage means that it is impossible to go on to a further stage. When a person was forced to leave school after only 2 years of primary school education, it is not reflection on him that he is academically and intellectually less developed than someone who had the opportunity to be schooled right through the university level. What Africa experienced in the early century of trade was precisely a loss of development opportunity, and this is one of the greatest importance. One of the features associated with technological advance is a spirit of scientific inquiry closely related to the process of production. This leads to inventiveness and innovation. During the period of the capitalist development in Europe, this was very much the case. A historian lay great emphasis on the spirit of inventiveness of the English in the 18th century. Socialist societies do not leave inventions merely to chance or good luck or good luck. They actively cultivate tendencies for innovation. For instance, in the German Democratic Republic, the youth established a quote, young innovators, end quote, fair. In 1958, calling upon the intellectual creativities of socialist youth so that within 10 years, over 2,000 new inventions were presented at that fair. The connection between Africa and Europe from the 15th century onward served to block this spirit of technological innovation, both directly and indirectly. So they got rid of that for Africa. The European slave trade was directly blocked, removing millions of youth and young adults who are the human agents front whom inventiveness springs. Those who remain in areas badly hit by slave capturing were preoccupied about their freedom rather than improvements in production. Besides, even the busiest African in West, Central, and East Africa was concerned more with trade than with production because of the nature of the contacts with Europe. And that situation was not conducive to the of Africa became associated with foreign trade, notably Afro-Portuguese. Middlemen, Upper Guinea, and Akan market women, the Afro traders of Mozambique, and the Swahili and the Wayuzimanzi of East Africa. The trade which they carried on was in export items like captives and ivory, which did not acquire the invention of machinery. Apart from that, there were agents for distributing European imports. When Britain was the world's leading economic power, it used to be referred to as a nation of shopkeepers. But most of the goods in their shops were produced by themselves, and it was while grappling with the problems posed by production that their engineers came up with so many inventions. In Africa, the trading groups could make no contributions to technological improvements because their role and preoccupation took their minds and energies away from production. Apart from inventiveness, we must also consider the borrowing of technologies. When a society, from whatever reason, finds itself technologically trailing behind others, it catches up not so much by independent inventions, but by borrowing. Indeed, very few of man's major scientific discoveries have been separately discovered in different places by different people. Once a principle or a tool is known, it spreads or diffuses to other peoples. Why then did European technology fail to make its way into Africa during the many centuries of contact between the two continents? The basic reason is that the very nature of European trade was highly unfavorable to the movement of positive ideas and techniques from the European capitalist system to African pre-capitalist communal feudal and pre-feudal system of production. The only non-European society that borrowed effectively from Europe and became capitalist is that of Japan. Japan was already highly developed feudal society progressing towards its own capitalist form in the 19th century. Its people were neither enslaved nor colonized by Europe. Its foreign trade relations were quite advantageous. For instance, Japanese textile manufacturers had the stimulus of their own growing internal market, and some abroad in Asia and Europe. Under those circumstances, the young Japanese capitalist class, including many former feudalist landowners, borrowed technology from Europe and successfully domesticated it before the end of the 19th century. The use of this example from outside Africa is meant to emphasize that for Africa to have received European technology, demand would have had to come from inside Africa, and most probable from the class or group who saw profit in the new technology. There had to be both willingness on the part of Europeans to transfer technology to an African socio-economic structures capable of making use of that technology and internalizing it. So they kept it. Thank you for reposting. I appreciate that. Who was up? He was in there. All right, we haven't got any that much coins, just Aziz. Hunting for elephants or captives did not usually induce in Africa a demand for any technology other than firearms. The lines of economic activity attached to foreign trade were either destructive, as slavery was, or at best purely extractive, like ivory hunting and cutting camwood trees. Therefore, there was no reason for wanting to call upon European skills. The African economies would have had little room for such skills unless negative types of exports were completely stopped. The remarkable fact that is seldom brought to light is that several African rulers in different parts of the continent saw the situation clearly and sought European technology for internal development, which was meant to replace the trade in slaves. Europeans deliberately ignored those African requests that Europe should place certain skills and techniques at their disposal. This was an element in the Congo situation of the early 16th century, which has already been mentioned. It happened in Ethiopia also, though in Ethiopia no trade in captives was established with Europeans. A Portuguese embassy reached the court in 1520. Having examined Portuguese sword, muskets, clothes, books, and other objects, the Emperor Lebanon Dengel felt the need to introduce European technical knowledge into Ethiopia. Correspondence exists between the Emperor of European rulers, such as King Manuel I and John III of Portugal and Pope Leo X, in which requests were made for European assistance to Ethiopian industry. Until late in the 19th century, Ethiopian petitions to that effect were being repeated with little or no success. In the first half of the 18th century, there were two further examples of African rulers appreciating European technology and slating their preference for skills and not slave ships. When Aji Turdu of Dahomey sought to stop the trade of captives, he made an appeal to European craftsmen, and he sent an ambassador to London for that purpose. One European who stayed at the court of Dahomey in the late 1720s told his countrymen that, quote, if any tailor, carpenter, smith, or any other sort of white man that is free be willing to come here, he will find very good encouragement, end quote. The Ashantian Apuku, where 1720 to 1750 also asked Europeans to set up factories and distilleries in Ashanti, but he got no response. Bearing in mind the history of Japan, it should be noted that the first request for technical assistance came from Ethiopian and the Congo empires, which in the 16th century were at a level undoubtedly comparable to that of most European feudal states, with the important exceptions that they had not produced the seeds of capitalism. During the 18th century, the great African states of Dahomey and Shanti became preeminent. They had passed out of the communal stage and had a somewhat feudal class stratification, along with specialization in many activities such as the working of gold, iron, and cloth. Shanti society under Obaku where had already shown a capacity for seeking out innovations by going through the trouble of taking imported silk and unraveling it so as to combine the silk thread with cotton to make the famous Kentel cloth. In other words, there have been no difficulty in such African societies mastering European technical skills and bridging the rather narrow gap which existed between them and Europe at that time. Well into the 19th century, Europe displayed the same indifference to requests for practical assistance from Africa. Although by that period, both African rulers and the European capitalists were talking about replacing slave trade. In the early 19th century, one king of Kalbara in eastern Nigeria wrote the British asking for sugar refinery, while around 1804, King Abazonian of Dahomey was bold enough to ask for a firearms factory. By that date, many parts of West Africa were going to war with European firearms and gunpowder. There grew up a saying in Dahomey that, quote, he who makes the powder wins the war, end quote, which was a far-sighted recognition that Africans were bound to fall before the superiority of Europeans in the field of arms of the arms technology. Of course, Europeans were also fully aware that their armed technology was decisive, and there was not the slightest chance that they would have agreed to teach Africans to make firearms and ammunition. The circumstances of African trade with Europe were unfavorable to creating a consistent African demand for technological relevant to development. And when the demand was raised, it was ignored or rejected by the capitalists. After all, it would not have been in the interest of capitalism to develop Africa. In more recent times, Western capitalists had refused to build the Volta River Dam for Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, until they realized that the Czechoslovakians would do the job. They refused to build the Aswan Dam in Egypt, and the Soviet Union had to come to the rescue. And in a similar situation, they placed obstacles in the way of the building of the railways from Tanzania to Zambia. And it was the socialist state of China that stepped in to express solidarity with African peasants and workers in a practical way. Placing the whole question of historical perspectives allows us to see that capitalism has always discouraged technological evolution in Africa and blocks Africa's access to its own technologies, as will be seen in subsequent sections. Capitalism introduced into Africa only such limited aspects into material culture as were essential to more efficient exploitation. But the general tendency has been for capitalism to underdevelop Africa in technology. The European slave trade and overseas trade in general had what are known as multiplier effects, quote unquote, on Europe's development in a very positive sense. This means that the benefit of foreign contacts extended to many areas of European life not directly connected with foreign trade, and the whole society was better equipped for its own internal development. The opposite is true of Africa, not only in the crucial spheres of technology, but also with regards to the size and purpose of each economy in Africa. Under the normal processes of evolution, an economy grows steadily larger, so that after a while, two neighboring economic merges into one. That was precisely how national economies are created in the slates of Western Europe. Although the gradual combinations of what were once separate provincial economies. Trade with Africa actually helped Europe to wield together more closely the different national economies. But in Africa, there was disruption and disintegration at the local level. At the same time, each local economy ceased to be directed exclusively or even primarily towards the stratification of the wants of its inhabitants, and whether or not the particular Africans recognized it, their economic efforts served external interests and made them dependent on those external forces based in Western Europe. In this way, the African economy, taken as a whole, was diverted away from its previous line of development and became distorted because it only served the interests of the European economy and the developments of Europe. They purposely did that. It is now becoming common knowledge that one of the principal reasons why genuine industrialization cannot easily be realized in Africa today is that the market for manufactured goods in a single African country is too small, and there is no integration of the markets across large areas of Africa. The kind of relationship which Africa has had with Europe from the very beginning has worked in the direction opposite to integration of local economics. Certain interterritorial links established on the continent were broken down after the 15th century because of European trade. Several examples arose in West African coast down to Angola. Because of those parts, European trade was most voluminous, and the surviving written records is also more extensive. Even when the Portuguese arrived in the regions of modern Ghana in 1470s, they had few commodities to offer to the inhabitants. In exchange for gold, covenant by covenant by Europe. However, they were able to transship from Benin to Nigeria supplies of cotton cloth, beads, and female slaves, which were soluble in the Gold Coast. The Portuguese were responding to a given demand on the Gold Coast, so that a previous trade must have been in existence between the people of Benin and those of the Gold Coast, particularly in Akan, A-K-A-N. In Akan, where gold producers and the people of Benin were specialist craftsmen who had a surplus of cloth and beads, which they manufactured themselves. As an expansionist state with a large army, Benin also had access to prisoners of war, while the Akan seems concerned with building their own population and labor force, so the latter acquired female captives from Benin and readily integrated them as wives, where the Portuguese intervened in this exchange. It was subordinated to the interest of European trade. As soon as Portugal and other European nations had sufficient goods so as not to be dependent on the re-export of certain commodities from Benin, then all the remaining were the links between Gold Coast and Europe, and on the one hand between Benin and Europe, and on the other. Probably Benin products had reached the Gold Coast by way of the creeks behind the coast and what is now Dahomey and Tongo. Therefore, it would have been more convenient when Europeans established a direct link across the open seas. As pointed out earlier, the superiority of the Europeans at sea was the greatest strategic value, along with their organizational ability. This was illustrated in several places, beginning with the Maghreb and Mauritanian. After the Portuguese took control of the Atlantic coast in southwest Africa, they were able to secure horses, woolen goods, and beads, which they shipped further south to West Africa for gold and slaves. Up to the early 16th centuries, the most important articles bought by the Portuguese for trade in Senegambian was the horse. Then in exchange for one horse, they received as many as 15 captives. North African woolens and beads were also utilized by the Portuguese in buying gold on the river Gambia and as far south as Sierra Leone. It needs to be recalled that the West Sudan had links with West African coast and with North Africa long before European arrived. Horses were moving from North Africa to be interbred with local West African stock. Long before the European arrival, the Arabs and the Mauritanians traveled to the river Senegal and farther south to meet the Mandinga, Dojola traders and hand over to them products such as beads made in Ceuta and cloth spun from the wool of North African sheep, with the advantage of rapidity of transport by sea as opposed to overland across the desert. The Portuguese were, in effect, breaking up the economic integration of the region, as with the Benin-Akan example. The point to note is that after the Portuguese became middlemen, they had the opportunity of developing a new trade pattern by which new Northwest Africa and West Africa looked to Europe and forgot about each other. A similar situation came into existence in Upper Guinea coast, and this time the European exploitation was aided by the presence of white settlers in Cape Verde Islands. The Portuguese and the Cape Verde settlers broke into patterns of local Upper Guinea trade as early as the 1470s. They intervened in transfers of raw cotton and indigo dye from one African community to another, and the Cape Verdean settlers established a flourishing cotton growing and cotton manufacturing industry. They used labor and techniques from the mainland and exported the finished products along the length of the coast down to Accra. The Portuguese also took over the trade in cowries in the Congo and its offshore islands, the trade of salt along the Angolan coast, and the trade of high-quality palm cloth between northern and southern Angola. In some instances, they achieved dominance, not just because of their ship and commercial skills, but also by the use of force, providing they were operating on the coast and could bring their cannon into use. In East Africa, for instance, the Portuguese used violence to capture trade from the Arabs and Swahili. The disruption of African commerce between the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast followed that pattern. All right, take a little small break here for a second. Followed that pattern. Look back, just in case there's anybody that said anything, which probably not, which is okay. All right, who's here? Katrine. A strong coastal canoe trade existed between the two regions, with the people of Cape Lahu, modern Ivory Coast, sailing past Cape 3 Points to sell their cloth as far east as Accra. The Portuguese set up a fort of Exum near Cape 3 Points to service gold trade with the hinterland, and one of its functions was to chop the cast west coastal African trade. They banned Exum residents from going to Cape Leon, and they stopped canoes from Ivory Coast from traveling east beyond Exum. AXIM, by the way. Their purpose was obviously to make both areas separate economic entities exclusively tied to Europe. The above-mentioned African commerce proved to have deep roots. The Dutch found it still going on when they took over Exum in 1637. The servants of the Dutch West Indian Companies, Exum in 1634. The servants of the Dutch West Indian Company, which was operating on the Gold Coast, wanted to put a complete stop to the African trade, and when that was not achieved, they tried to force the people of the Ivory Coast to buy a certain amount of Dutch goods. The Dutch ruled that each Exum canoe man going to Cape Leon should carry Dutch goods worth at least 4 ounces of gold. The purpose was to convert the purely inter-African exchange into a European-African trade. What was doubly detrimental to Africa attempts to integrate their own economies was the fact that when Europeans became middlemen in local trade networks, they did so mainly to facilitate the extractions of captives and thereby subordinating the whole economy to the European slave trade. In the Upper Guinea and the Cape Verde Islands, the Portuguese and they used the M words, half black, half white, but they used the M word. Descendants engaged in a large variety of exchanges involving cotton, dyes, canola nuts, and European products. The purpose of it all was to fill the holds of slave ships. In Congo and Angola, the same picture emerges. The salt cowrie shells, and paint cloth that came in Portuguese hand made up for their shortage of trade goods and served to purchase captives on different parts of the coast and deep in the interior. The elements of subordination and independence crucial to to an understanding of African underdevelopment today, and its roots lie far back in the era of international trade. It is also worth noting that there is a type of false or pseudo-integration which is camouflage for dependency. In contemporary times, it takes the form of free trade areas in the formerly colonized sections of the world. Those free trade areas are made to order for the penetration of multinational corporations. From the 15th century onward, pseudo-integration appeared in the form of interlocking of African economics over long distance from the coast, so as to allow the passage of human captives and ivory from a given point inland to a given port in the Atlantic or Indian Ocean. For example, captives were moved from Congo through what is now Zambia and Malawi to Mozambique, where Portuguese, Arabic people, or French buyers took them over. That was not genuine integration of the economies of the African territories concerned. Such trade merely represented the extent of foreign penetration, thereby stealing local trades. The West African gold trade was not destroyed, but it became directly dependent on European buyers by being diverted from the northward routes across the Sahara. Within the savanna belt of West Sudan, the Trans-Sahara gold trade had nourished one of the most highly developed political zones in all Africa from the 5th century onwards. But it was more convenient for Europe to obtain its gold on the west coast than through North African intermediaries, and one is left to speculate on what might have occurred in Western Sudan if there had been a steady increase of gold trade over the 17th and 18th century. Nevertheless, there is something to be said in favor of African trade with Europe and its particular commodity, gold production involving mining and other orderly systems of disruption within Africa. Akan country and parts of Zimbabwe and Mozambique sustained flourishing socio-political systems put up to the 19th century, largely because gold production. Certain benefits also derive from the export of ivory. The search for ivory became the most important activity in several East African societies at one time or another. Sometimes the combinations with the trade in captives, the Wanyamazin of Tanzania, were East Africans' best-known traders, acquiring their reputation through carrying goods for hundreds of miles between Lake Tanganyika and the Indian Ocean. When the Wanyamazis gave their attention to export of ivory, this sparked off other beneficial developments such as an increased trade in hose, food, and salt between themselves and their neighbors. Yet ivory was an asset that was rapidly exhausted in any given region, and the struggle to secure new supplies would lead to violence comparable to that which accompanied the search for human captives. Besides, the most decisive limitations of ivory trade was the fact that it did not grow logically from local needs and local production. Large quantities of ivory were not required by any societies inside of Africa, and no African society turned to elephant hunting and ivory collection on a big scale until the demand came from Europe or Asia. Any African society which took ivory export seriously then had to restructure its economy so to make ivory trade successful. That in turn led to excessive and undesirable dependency on the overseas market and an external economy. There could be growth in the volume of commerce and the rise of some positive side effects, but there was decrease in the capacity to achieve economic independency and self-sustaining social progress. Besides, at the time, one must keep in mind that dialectical opposites of the trade in Africa, namely production in Europe or in America under European control. A few socially desirable byproducts of elephant hunting within Africa were chicken feed in comparison with the profits, technology, and skills associated with the product in Europe. Technology and skill associated with the in that way, the gap between Africa and Europe was constantly widening, and it is on the basis of that gap that we arrive at of the development and underdevelopment. Continued politico-military development in Africa, 1500 to 1885. Take a little break, small break. No one's saying much, which is okay. Modern African. So basically, that section is like how to divert any economic things in Africa with other African nations, and how to keep it mainly supplying the European countries instead by disrupting and stuff. Now, let's go on to this. Modern African nationalist historians correctly stress that Africa had a meaningful past long before the coming of Europeans. They also stress that Africans made their own history long after coming into contact with Europe, and indeed right up to the period of colonization. That African-centered approach to the continent past is quite compatible with one which equally emphasizes the I gotta do this word. I'm sorry, everybody. It's throwing me off. Transformatory role of external forces such as overseas trade in slaves, gold, and ivory, the reconciliation. I gotta do this word. Sometimes the easy words just throw me off. Reconciliation, I think. Can you hear it?
Reconciliation.
The reconciliation of the two approaches is facilitated by bearing in mind the following three factors. Number one, the external and mainly European impact up to 1885 was very uneven in geographical terms, with the coasts being obviously more exposed. 2. Commerce with Europeans affected different aspects of African life in varying degrees, with a political, military, and ideological apparatus being virtually untouched. Number 3. Dynamic features of independent African evolution and development, as illustrated in Chapter 2, continued to operate after 1500. It has already been argued that it would be misleading to try to compartmentalize Africa into areas that were affected by slave trading and those which were not. For the continent, as a whole, had to bear the cost. However, for present purposes, it is enough to make a crude distinction between those parts of Africa which were directly caught up in European-generated activities and those parts which, to all appearances, continued in the traditional manner. Developments continued in certain areas such as South Central Africa, because the population there was free to pursue a path dictated by the interplay between African people and the African environment in particular localities. Besides, there were achievements even in those societies under the heaviest bombardment of slaving. Slave trade led to the commercial domination of Africa by Europe within the context of international trade. In very few instances did Europeans manage to displace African political authorities in various social systems. So African states in close contact with Europe in the pre-colonial era nevertheless had scope of political maneuver, and their evolution could and did continue. Military conquest of Africa awaited the years of the imperialist scramble. In pre-colonial countries, the contact with African armies were in existence, with all the social political implications which attach to an armed sector of society. Equally important was the fact that direct imports from Europe in the cultural and ideological spheres were virtually nil. Christianity tried sporadically and ambivalently to make an impact on some parts of the continent, but most of the few missionaries in places like the Congo, Angola, and Upper Guinea concentrated on blessing Africans as they were about to be launched across the Atlantic into slavery. It was Christianity continued only in Ethiopia, where it had indigenous roots. Elsewhere, there flourished Islam and other religions which had nothing to do with European trade. As before, religion continued to act as an element of the superstructure, which was crucial in the development of the state. So long as there is political power, so long as a people can be mobilized to use weapons, and so long as the society has the opportunity to define its own ideologies and culture, then the people of that society have some control over their own destinies in spite of constraints which such as those imposed as African continent slipped into orbit as a satellite of capitalist Europe. After all, although historical development is inseparable from material conditions and the state of technology, it is also partially controlled by a people's consciousness at various stages. That is part of the interdependence of base and superstructure alluded to an outset. Okay, so when they mean base and superstructure, they mean like the economic base. Like, for instance, the economic base for us is capitalism. And in that economic basis, you have the class distinctions, and then you have the tools, the manufacturings of all of those distinctions that builds the economic base. The economic base then produces and reflects the definition through superstructures. Superstructures are the ones that create through the definition of the economic base of like religion, schooling, politics, any other superstructures, medical, military, all those are superstructures of the economic base. Both of those come in contact with each other and create a relationship, and they're produced and made by human beings. Revolution is the most dramatic appearance of a conscious people or class on the stage of history, but To greater or lesser extent, the ruling class in any society has always engaged in the developmental process of conscious instruments of change or conservatism. Attention is, in this section, will be focused on the political spheres and its power companion, the military. In those areas, Africans were able to excel, even in the face of slave trading. Politico-military development in Africa from 1500 to 1885 meant that African social collectives have become more capable of defending the interests of their members as opposed to the interests of people outside of given community. It also meant that the individuals in the politically matured military strong states would be free from external threats of physical removal. He would have more opportunities to apply his own skills in fields as diversified as ministerially and bronze working under the protection of the state. He could also use his creativity and inventiveness to refine the religion of his people, or to work out a more manageable constitution, or to contribute a new technique of war, or to advance agriculture and trade. Of course, it is also true that the benefits of all such contributions went mainly to a small section of African society, both within and without the zones of slaving. For as communalism receded, the principles of egalitarian distribution was disregarded. These various points can be illustrated by concrete historical examples drawn from all over the continent during the pre-colonial period in question. The Yorubo. I think it's the Yorubo. It's pretty long. The Yorubo. In the previous discussions, the Yorubo state of Oyo was merely listed as one of the outstanding representatives of African development up to the eve of European arrival in the 15th century. The remarkable 14th and 15th century artistic achievements of Oye, of its parent state of If, and of the related state of Benin have been well studied because of the preservation of ivory, terracotta, and bronze sculptures. It is clear that the earliest bronze were the best, and that there was a deterioration in execution and sensitivities from the 16th through the 18th centuries. However, politically states such as Oye and Benin did continue to prosper for a very long time after the arrival of Europeans on the West African coast. Since Oye and the Yoruba people were within the intensive area of slave trading, their fate between 1500 and 1885 is of considerable significance. The kingdom of Oyo kept fairly clear of any involvement with slave trading until the late 18th century. Instead, its people concentrated on local production and trade, and on the consolidation of expansion of trade. Indeed, although the nucleus of the Oyo kingdom had already been established in the 15th century, it was during the next 3 centuries that it expanded to take control of most of what is later termed Western Nigeria, large zones north of the river Niger, and the whole of what is now Dahomey. In effect, it was an empire ruled over by an Alfin, in conjunction with the aristocracy. It was in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that the subtle constitutional mechanisms which regulated relations between the Alifin and his principal subjects and between the capital and the provinces were crystallized. Insofar as Oye had an interest in the coast, it was as an outlet more for cloth than for slaves. Being some distance inland, the Yoruba and Oye concentrated on relations with the hinterland, thereby connecting with the southern Sudanic trading zones. It was from the north that Oye got the horses which made its armies feared and respected. Oye was a prime example of that African development which had its root deep in the past. In the contradictions between man and environment, its people continued to develop on the basis of forces which they did not cautiously manipulate, as well as through the deliberate utilization of political techniques. Early in the 19th century, Oyi and Yoruba land in general began to export captives in considerable numbers. They were obtained partly by military campaigns outside Yoruba land, but also through local slave procuring. Local slave procuring involved kidnapping, armed raids, uncertainty, and disunity. Those features, together with internal constitutional tensions and an external threat from the Islamic North, brought about the downfall of the Oye Empire by about 1830. The famous Yoruba ancestral homes of life was also despoiled, and its citizens turned into refugees because of the quarrels among the Yoruba over kidnapping for sale into slavery. But it was a testimony to the level of development in that part of Africa that within a few years the inhabitants were able to construct new political states, notably those of New Oye, Adian and Ajay and Abu Kuta and Ijabu, each centered on a town and with enough land for successful agriculture, until the British arrived to kindly impose, quote, order, end quote, in Nigeria. The Yoruba people kept experimenting with various political forms with heavy emphasis on the military and keeping to the religion of their forefathers, being conscious of territorial boundaries and the inhabitants and rulers of any given state variably become involved in clashes with neighboring states. The state in the feudal epoch in Europe and Asia, and particularly concerned with the military capacity. The ruling class comprised in whole or in part of professional fighting forces of the state. One rationalization by which they justified their employment of the major portions of the surplus of society was that they offered armed protection to ordinary peasants and serfs. This generalization was as true of 19th century Yoruba land as it was in Prussia and Japan. Without a doubt, Africans in that region were proceeding along the line of development leading to social organization comparable to feudalism in Europe, Asia, and such parts of Africa as Ethiopia and the Maghreb, which had been at that stage some centuries earlier. In the Oye Empire, the civil power was dominant, and the military generals were servants of the king. Subsequently, however, the military took over effective political power. For instance, the Aji state was founded by Kuruma, said to have been the greatest Yoruba general of those troubled times. Following the fall of Oye, yeah, thank you, it is. Kuruma established a personal military ascendancy of Aje. Excuse me with like mispronouncing. I think it's Abidan was slightly different in that there was a group of military officers who collectively formed a political elite. Efforts to put civilians back in power were half-hearted and unsuccessful. After all, the town itself grew out of military encampment. The city-state of Abakuta perhaps made the most consistent efforts to make the military an arm of the civil state. But what mattered most was the defense of the township within the fortified walls of Abakuta. Abakuta fortified walls became famous as the place where many a rival army met disaster, and under those circumstances the Olagan or war chiefs were the social and political powers. While the militarization of politics was going on in Yorubaland, changes were taking place in the structure of the society, which brought about sharper class stratification. Numerous captives were taken in war, most of whom were sold to Europeans, so that Yorubaland became notorious as a slave-supplying region right up to the 1860s. But many war prisoners were retained locally in conditions approximating either to slavery or to serfdom, depending on whether or not they were first-generation captives. Sometimes refugees fleeing from destroyed towns also had no options other than to become clients of or serfs of other free Yoruba. Such refugees were made to give service to their new overlords by farming the land in return for armed protection. However, serfs were also used as soldiers, which means that they had access to the means of production, the land, only through meeting the obligation in military labor. That is the measure of the extent to which the principle of kinship had been weakened. And it indicates that, in contrast to the typical communal village states, such as those in the 19th century, Yorubaland allocated roles and rewards to their citizens on the basis of reciprocal obligation, characteristics of feudalism. During the period under discussion, the division of labor among Yoruba was extended with the rise of professional soldiers, or, quote, war boys, end quote, as they were called. The professional soldiers who were sons of aristocrats, left farming disdainfully to prisoners and serfs, the large number of whom ensured agricultural plenty. Other branches of economic activity also nourished, notably the making of cloth and palm oil, and the trade of various products. These things were true, in spite of the fact that by the time some labor was being lost, both in form of slaves exported and in form of labor power devoted to capturing people for export, European visitors to Yorubaland in the middle of the 19th century could still admire the level of its material culture, along with the highly colorful and impressive aspects of its non-material culture, such as the annual, quote, yam festival, end quote, and the rural and religious cults of Shango and Ogobano and others. On items of European technology that was anxiously sought by Africans and that was fairly easily abstainable from Europeans as was the firearms. From the 1820s onward, the Yoruba acquired European firearms in large numbers and integrated them into the pattern of trade, politics, and military strategy. On the eve of the colonial world, Yoruba generals were reaching out for breech-loading rifles and even rockets, but Europe stepped in too quickly for that move to get very far. Through a series of actions which started as early as 1860s in Lagos, in which included missionary infiltration as well as armed invasions, the British managed to bring the part of Africa under colonial rule. Economic development is a matter of an increasing capacity to produce, and it is tied up with the pattern of land tenure and class relations. These basic facts were well brought out both positively and negatively in Yoruba history in the decades before independence was lost. So long as agricultural production was not disrupted, then for so long any given Yoruba state remained in a strong position. Adenian was once the greatest military power in Yorubaland, selling captives as well as retaining many for use of laborers for its own benefits. But Ibadan's farming areas were hit by war, and Ibadan's rulers also started removing prisoners, farming the land and selling them instead to Europeans. That became necessary because Ibadans needed firearms, and those could be obtained only by selling slaves. Who else is in here? Asha. All right, going back. Hyper-based. I like that. Thank you for saying that. If you're still here. It was at the point that the undermining effect of the presence of European slave buyers on the coast became really paramount. By selling its own captives and serfs, Ibadan was undermining its own socio-economic base. If the prisoners were to develop into a true serf class, then those prisoners would have had to be guaranteed the right to remain fixed on the soil and protected from sale. This was one of the reasons why slavery as a mode of production in Europe had to give way to serfdom and feudalism. And under normal circumstances, Yoruba society did rapidly guarantee the irremovability of those captives who were integrated into the local production pattern. But forces unleashed by European presence as slave buyers were too great to be withstood, and any hope of solving the problem disappeared with the loss of political power under colonialism. Too often historians lay undue emphasis on the failure of the 19th century Yoruba states to unite and produce an entity as large as the former empire of Oyo. But firstly, the size of a political unit is not the most important criterion for evaluating the achievements of its peoples. And secondly, a given people can disintegrate politically and later integrate even more effectively. The Yoruba state of Ibadan, Obukutu, and Ayayi had populations of up to 100,000 citizens, as large as most of the city-states, principalities, and the Palatinites. Let me find out what this word means. Sorry for not being so good at words. P-A-L-A-T-I-N. Let's find out what this word is.
Palatinate.
Palatinates, which is a territory under a jurisdiction of a count or a palatine, like Emperor Palatinates of feudal Germany. That is a comparison which is worth bringing to light, and it is one that struck European observers who happened to visit Euroboland in the middle years of the 19th century. Germany has long had a common culture and language, and there was a form of political unity under the Holy Roman Empire from the 12th to the 15th century. However, after the Reformation and the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, the German people were divided into as many separate political entities as there are days in the year, some of them being hardly bigger than a political park. Yet the internal class relations and productive forces continued to develop throughout Germany, and ultimately by 1870 unity was again achieved, with feudalism giving way to a powerful capitalist nation-state. Similarly, the Yoruba were a widely separate cultural entity with a single language. After the fall of the Oye Empire, the development process were slowed down by both internal and external factors, but they were not stopped. It took the arrival of the European colonialism to do that. Within the sphere of West and Central Africa, African slaving, state building continued with varying degrees of success. For instance, the Akan state system grew up in the matter of impressive as that of the Oye Empire. Fortunately for the Akan slave export reached alarming proportions only during the first half of the 18th century. But by that time, the states such as Ashanti had sunk roots deep enough to withstand the adverse effect of slaving. It continued to incorporate with the heartland of the Western Sudan, and by the 1870s, when the British tried to dictate to Ashanti, these famous African people did not give up without heroic armed struggle. The Ashanti's connections with the export of slaves in the 18th century led its rulers to concentrate the expansionism of the type which would bring in captives through war, raids, tributes, and as articles of trade from regions where there had been made prisoners. Besides, since the 15th century, a king country was building up rather than exporting its human resources. Captives were incorporated locally into the societies, and on the eve of colonialism, a substantial proportions of Ashanti society had made up the Obadanko Boo, and the descendants of a one-time captives who were the laboring population on the land. Development had come not through exporting and losing labor, but by increasing and maximizing it. So what they did is they had captives, but they integrated them as laborers. The homie. What do I got? Ooh, that's a perfect time to spot. Look at that. Holy crap. The homie's next. We'll stop there for the night. All right. Nice. So it's not without saying that some of these things, they didn't take captives specifically for enslaving them. They took them and then integrated them, even though they integrated them as laborers. They didn't do the slaving that Europeans wanted to do. The chattel slavery shit. So next we'll do Dahomey on the roots of on Europe and the roots of African underdevelopment. So it's talking about how like certain things that did, like certain things that were not dealt with slave. Oh, what page? 139. Sorry. That it like the taking of slaves and stuff like that, and kidnapping did affect people's economies, did affect people's development. And then they're also talking about other places that like did get captives, but still try to maintain all their shit. But then colonialism comes along and says, nope, not letting you do that. So some of these countries, these African countries, did fight back, just like indigenous people of Turtle Island. They did fight back. Some of them failed. Some of them were completely oversaturated and overwhelmed by things. So yeah, interesting. Let's see what we got here. Dahomey is next. That was awesome that I stopped right there at 8. The Eastern Lacustrian states. We'll go over that. We'll go over Rwanda, looks like. Amin Zulu. I don't know what that is. And then the coming of imperialism and colonialism. Interesting. So this is good stuff. I really enjoyed this book, and I'm glad people came in and are like, yeah, this is cool stuff. Is this chapter 4? I'm not in chapter 4, am I? Anybody wants to come up and ask for any questions, you're welcome to come up. Hold on a second. I'm looking back. Who's in here? I don't know who TikTok Son is. Who are you, TikTok Son? What do you want? Don't know who you are. Who are you, TikTok Son? Who you be? This can't be chapter 3. Is this chapter 3? As soon as I find a damn chapter. This is chapter 4. Holy shit. I have no idea who this person is. All right. If no one wants to come up and ask questions, I guess I'll just close it out for the night. Don't know what happened to Joe. Anyways. All right, everybody. I wish you well. Have a good night. Since no one had any questions or anything, I'm going to close it out. Good night.